On the 5th of November in the year 1605, agents of Great Britain's King James searched the cellars underneath the Parliament buildings in London. There they discovered 36 barrels of gunpowder guarded by a man armed with a slow-burning fuse. A few days earlier, Lord Monteagle had been warned of a plot to blow up the House of Lords at the opening of Parliament, thereby killing the Protestant king so that he could be replaced by a Catholic monarch. The plot was the work of a group of English Catholics whose faith was repressed by the king's policies, and the man with the fuse had been recruited after spending years abroad fighting with the Spaniards against the Dutch. Under interrogation, he admitted that his assignment had been to blow up the House of Lords. Under torture, he revealed the names of his fellow plotters as well as his own, Guy Fawkes. Found guilty of high treason and condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, Fawkes jumped from the gallows in order to break his own neck and avoid the excruciation of what would follow his hanging, evisceration and dismemberment while still alive. From such gory beginnings, November 5th is observed in Britain with family-oriented bonfires, food, and fireworks displays. Originating as a mandated celebration that the king survived an attempted assassination, Guy Fawkes Night has thankfully grown beyond its original anti-Catholic sentiment and now represents a uniquely British holiday on a par with the American Halloween. In the weeks before Bonfire Night, as it's known, children would make figures out of newspapers and old clothes and ask people for a penny for the guy for firewood. Such figures would be burnt on November 5th bonfires in memory of Fawkes' role in the Gunpowder Plot. As we approach Election Day this week, we can be thankful that civic life in the United States still proceeds considerably more peaceably than it did in 17th century Great Britain, even with the ongoing efforts to weaken and undermine democracy. We need to remember that living in a constitutional federal republic with democratically elected leaders, governance is ultimately the responsibility of we the people ourselves, not a monarch nor a class of oligarchs claiming a special mandate, divine or otherwise. The Gunpowder Plot and the commemoration that followed show church and state at their worst. So with Election Day this week, let's talk religion and politics at their best from a UU perspective. It's time for love and democracy. For generations of British children, there were 3 holidays that were the highlight of the year. There was, of course, Christmas, which was all about food and family and presents, and Easter, which for us was all about chocolate eggs. In third place was Bonfire Night, which was all about a huge bonfire, food like potatoes baked in said bonfire that were so hot you couldn't hold them without gloves, let alone eat them, and big firework displays that lit up the sky. In case you're wondering about Halloween, it just wasn't a big deal, at least when I was growing up. We knew it was an American holiday that somehow involved pumpkins. In school, we were taught about Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot, though of course it was a Baudelarized version for children. Yes, we were told that Fawkes and some others had tried to blow up Parliament to kill the king. No, we were not told that it was part of decades of often bloody violence between Protestants and Catholics since Henry VIII had created the Church of England. Protestant monarchs had repressed Catholics, Catholic monarchs had repressed Protestants, particularly during the reign of Henry's daughter, Bloody Mary. Yes, we were told that Fawkes was caught and later executed. No, we were not told the details about what it meant to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. given that big bonfires were part of Guy Fawkes Night and that the guys made from old clothes stuffed with newspapers were thrown onto the fires, we just assumed he was burned to death, not strangled, cut open, and chopped into pieces. We certainly were not told as children how bonfire night came to be a holiday. First, there was the observance of the 5th of November Act, initiated by King James and passed by Parliament in 1606, that mandated an annual public day of thanksgiving for the failure of the Gunpowder Plot. This act required churches to hold special services on November 5th each year, during which the minister had to read out loud the entire text of the act, including its polemic against, quote, many malignant and devilish papists, Jesuits, and seminary priests. Everyone in the parish was required to attend and to, quote, abide orderly and soberly throughout the service. Soon enough, November 5th, which became known as Gunpowder Treason Day, was England's biggest state commemoration. It was also a focus for anti-Catholic sentiment. Then James's son, who would become King Charles, married a Catholic. So now the Protestants were fighting against each other, the Puritans fighting against the Royalists, all of it fuel for the coming English Civil War. It took about 200 years for the anti-Catholic rhetoric to die down, by which time any violence on what was now Guy Fawkes Day was more often based in social class rather than religion. And the observance of the 5th of November Act was repealed in 1859. I don't think it's a coincidence that while all this was going on in England, the newly formed United States of America was embracing religious freedom. We cannot credit our Congregationalist ancestors, the Puritans, for this. They were really only seeking religious freedom for themselves, and it was basically an accident that they based their faith on covenant rather than creed. Rather, credit goes to some Virginians, such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Enacted into law by the State Assembly in 1789, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom disestablished the Church of England in Virginia and guaranteed freedom of religion to people of all faiths, including Christians of all denominations, Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. It was an important precursor to the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. In case you're wondering, Jefferson and arguably Madison were small U Unitarian in their religious views. But unlike the Adamses say, they were not members of big U Unitarian churches. Now, there weren't any such churches in Virginia at the time, but they could have helped start one, just like John Quincy Adams did with All Souls in Washington, D.C. Freedom of religion has been in the news quite a bit in recent years, with court cases about how much employers need to accommodate the religious practices of their employees, and whether bakers are required to make wedding cakes for gay couples. Now it's in the news again, thanks to the election as new Speaker of the House of Representatives of someone who evidently considers the Bible more important in his job than the Constitution. Or rather, as Stephen Colbert pointed out, only selected pieces of the Bible that support the speaker's pre-existing bigotry. And it's pretty clear that Jefferson and Madison would have agreed with Colbert, not Johnson. In one of her columns this week, political historian Heather Cox Richardson went into detail about this. She explained that Madison, having seen preachers arrested for arguing against the established church in Virginia, had quite a lot to say about why the government and religion must be kept apart. Quote, Madison explained that what was at stake was not just religion, but also representative government itself. The establishment of one religion over others attacked a fundamental human right, an unalienable right of conscience. Madison also believed that by allowing for religious freedom to be practiced, the state could avoid the religious violence that plagued England and Europe. As for Jefferson, in 1802, he wrote a letter to a group of Baptists in Connecticut, explaining that the First Amendment built a wall of separation between church and state. I believe that's where the phrase comes from. Jefferson went on to write, quote, adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. Of course, Jefferson only meant such rights to belong to white landowning men. However, he did see the need for the nation to preserve individual rights while at the same time trusting that such rights could not outweigh the needs of society. To put it another way, if individual rights took precedence over society, then there would be no society to protect individual rights. This provides a pretty clear answer to the question of whether a baker can refuse to make a wedding cake for a gay couple. If the baker is running a business that serves the public, then no, they don't get to decide who is and is not a member of the public, because then there would be nothing to stop someone from excluding the baker from the public too. The new speaker evidently believes that the wall of separation only protects religion from the state and does not protect the state from religion. As Colbert pointed out, that's utter nonsense. The government should not value one particular religious perspective over the others, though I would argue that that's effectively what the federal and many state governments do when it comes to issues like abortion and transgender rights, even gun control and climate change. Does this mean that we should stop being involved with organizations like Side with Love and the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy? Should we stop sharing our UU values with our elected representatives? Stop asking them to support or oppose legislation based on our UU views of what's better for society? No, not at all. If anything, we should be doing more. We should exercise our right of conscience more. We should engage with the democratic process more, because that's how we help safeguard our society from the loudest, most extreme voices that seem to want to turn back the clock on rights for people who are not white landowning men. Participating in inclusive democratic processes to make decisions on the basis of our own consciences and our own religious values is not violating the wall of separation between church and state. Claiming that any particular holy book or scripture should matter more than the Bill of Rights, that does violate the wall. Congregations organizing their members to witness and demonstrate and lobby for value-based causes and legislation, that does not violate the wall. Churches telling their members to vote for particular candidates, that does. Rather, when it comes to voting, our faith simply asks us to take love with us to the polls. So let's think about that. I'm going to ask you some wondering questions now, and I'll give you a little time after each to reflect. Jeffrey will put each question on the screen as I ask it. I wonder how you have benefited from the generosity of others. I wonder how you would describe the true origins of some of your favorite holiday traditions. I wonder when the blazing truth has awoken you to radiant love. I wonder how you exercise your right to conscience as part of your social duties. The right of conscience has been part of our faith for a long, long time. The early Unitarians and their various predecessors could, in good conscience, only believe that Jesus was fully human, just as the early Universalists could only believe that a loving God would ultimately restore all souls to heaven. The democratic process has similarly been part of our religious tradition for a long time, going back 400 years to our Congregationalist forebears who rejected both the religious and political hierarchies of England. Instead, they decided that each congregation should be free to elect its own leaders, call and ordain its own ministers, and make its own decisions, something that all UU congregations still practice today. Now, for 40 years, we've connected the right of conscience and the democratic process in the fifth principle of our UUA covenant, as if they are aligned, but actually, I think they're in tension. After all, unless we're somehow making all decisions unanimously, in which case we might need to ask if we're actually deciding anything important, there will inevitably be some individual consciences that end up at odds with the outcomes of a democratic process. But whether it's losing a vote or otherwise disagreeing with one another, we try to keep in front of us something that is absolutely essential: love. For in the words of the legendary Universalist preacher Hosea Ballou, if we agree in love, there is no disagreement that can do us any injury. But if we do not, no other agreement can do us any good. It's love that can manage the tension between the right of conscience and the democratic process. And so our faith asks us to take love with us to the polls. Love gives us the courage to cast aside fear, forsake anger, and reject cynicism, so that we can enjoy the privileges of citizenship with compassion for those with whom we disagree. Love reminds us to avoid self-serving pity and instead choose loving kindness for the poor, the hungry, the dispossessed. When we vote with love, we can do so as if the least of these were right there in the voting booth with us, guiding us all toward the beloved community. May it be so.